It's Eli. Okay, great. Got that out of the way. Now the good stuff. You know how I said that I intended to find out what the hell Tristan's deal was? Well, good news. I did. Bad news. He still won't tell us the part that would actually be super helpful because he's being an ass. Here's how it's been going. He's still staying at the bookstore, and even Zoe isn't a big fan of his anymore. We've given him one of the extra storage rooms upstairs to sleep in. We brought in a sleeping bag and the 2 pillows Waffles doesn't like and everything. At first I tried talking about a lot of my good memories with Nolan, but that honestly seemed to make things worse, because Tristan always found a way to twist them into my bad influence on his brother or how annoying we'd been acting from his point of view. Yeah, he's kind of a buzzkill. I've tried not to let it get to me when he makes his hatred of me clear, but it's hard. He's never liked me. He says it's because of the bad influence thing, but Nolan and I were always pretty well behaved, even as teenagers. We snuck out a few times, went to parties occasionally, but we didn't do anything crazy. Definitely nothing that would brand me as a bad influence. Maybe it goes all the way back to kindergarten when I hit Nolan on the head with a doll. Maybe that's what he means. Either way, what I'm trying to say is that Tristan disliking me isn't anything new, but I've tried not to hold it against him. I always make jokes with him and started conversations when I was over at Nolan's house. Come to think of it, that might have made him hate me more. Oops. Still, I think it's gotten worse. I swear to God, he's giving me a constant death glare for about 8 hours a day. I don't know how his facial muscles are strong enough to hold that much focused hatred, but damn, they sure are. It's his signature expression, the death glare, TM. After a day or two of Tristan shooting down my efforts, Zoe had shifted her opinion of him too. As we curled under the blankets on the second night and she took off her glasses, she said, I've really tried giving him the benefit of the doubt, but he kinda sucks. He's such a dick to you. The way he acts, you'd think you murdered Nolan. I know, I said, settling on the mattress beside her. He's always been like that. What's the opposite of a fan, because he's the president of that club? Maybe he's just jealous that Nolan likes you better than him, she said sleepily. Maybe, I agreed. Then she scooted over and laid her head on my chest, and Mr. Bailey curled up against my leg, so Tristan being an asshole suddenly seemed like a much less important problem. And yet, he's still here. Why he wants to be is anyone's guess. Honestly, I think he was hurt in the massacre more than he wants to admit and knows he'll be killed if he goes off on his own. I see him wince when he moves. His presence here means that some of our conversation practices have gotten weirder. Zoe and I talk privately in the soundproof room most of the time. Whenever we talk to him in the bookstore, we make sure it's nothing important about our next moves or plans. But that means that we have to invite him into the soundproof room with us when we want to interrogate him, and I don't think a single one of us is a fan of that. It took 4 days to find out what he was hiding from us. 4 days of jabs at me, insults, pointed silence. It was really great. That was sarcasm, in case my meaning wasn't clear through text. It was not a pleasant experience. You know, as awesome as Nolan is/was, I'm holding out hope for the is, you'd really think his brother would be less of a pain. But no. And look, I get it. He's never liked me anyway, he got swallowed by a bear, he's worried about Nolan. But it's not like I've had an easy life in the past year either, and I'd like to find Nolan just as much as Tristan would, so I think he needs to get over himself. But I digress. On that day, Zoe, Tristan, and I were all in the soundproof room. Zoe and I were sitting on the mattress, and Tristan had taken my old spot in the desk chair. He was mostly brooding and silent, giving me a steady death glare, TM, while Zoe and I talked. That is, until we reached our daily topic of searching for the elevator. Like he had every day before that when we started our escape discussions, Tristan let his death glare, TM, slip for just a second, and that same flash of knowing something and considering saying something but deciding not to appeared. It infuriated me every time, because I'd always point it out, and Tristan would simply tell me to fuck off. Not wanting to break tradition, when I saw his expression shift, I said, Hey Tristan, what do you know that you're not telling us? He immediately responded with the usual, fuck off. But this time it seemed more forced. He also didn't put back on the death glare, TM, mask right away. He actually seemed to be mulling something over. I could practically see the gears turning in his head. After a few seconds of silence, I figured he decided against it. I sighed and said, Okay, well, it's probably more likely to be in the... I think I know where it is. Tristan interrupted. His voice was quiet but firm. Zoe and I both stared at him in shock. The elevator. I think I saw it, he continued. Then, on that cliffhanger, he fucking paused. I waited for him to add on, but apparently that was as far as he was getting without prompting. Well, where the hell is it? I exclaimed. You know, Nolan and I listened to our parents die, he said. He sounded more dazed now, like he was letting his mind drift to the faraway reaches he hadn't been to in a while. If he was repressing his traumas as much as I was, he probably hadn't. His eyes, too, seemed to be looking at something far in the distance. I turned to look at Zoe and threw my hands up in a universal, "What the fuck is this?" gesture, but she simply shrugged and held her finger to her lips. She was probably right. Maybe if we just let him talk, he'd get to the point. As much as I didn't want to hear about Nolan's parents, R.I.P. Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds, you were great, or whatever Nolan may have suffered, I could handle it. And I did want to hear about Tristan's possible knowledge of the elevator. If he was telling the truth, That info was worth the wait. I was sleeping when it started, because I'd worked the overnight shift at IHOP like every Friday. My parents were downstairs, having coffee in the kitchen. It was Saturday, after all. Nolan was home for the weekend from college. You know that. He was going to hang out with you later that day, Tristan said, looking at me, although I wasn't sure he was actually seeing me. God, I wish he hadn't come home that weekend. If he wasn't in the city, he'd be fine now. He sighed heavily, almost shakily. Tristan's lived with their parents and worked different jobs since he graduated high school 5 years ago, I whispered to Zoe. First Pizza Hut, then Staples, now IHOP. Nolan went to college a few hours away and came home about once or twice a month. We would always meet up when he visited. Zoe nodded but didn't take her eyes off Tristan, who seemed to be gearing up to speak again. I didn't hear any of the first part. I'm a pretty heavy sleeper, he said. But suddenly Nolan was shaking me awake violently. I started to yell at him and ask him what the fuck he thought he was doing, but he slapped a hand over my mouth and told me to be quiet. Before I could protest or bite him, because I was going to, he hissed at me that he'd heard crashes and screams downstairs. He'd been in his room and started running for the stairs to go down and help our parents. But Dad yelled, "Boys, hide! Don't come down here!" And Nolan said he sounded both so authoritative and so scared that Nolan had to listen. By then I was pretty awake, obviously. I could hear muffled crashes and scuffling from downstairs, but it was hard to determine what they were, because Nolan was frantically whispering over and over that we had to stay quiet, we had to hide, and after a minute or so I shoved him off and said, okay, fine, come on. I didn't totally believe him. I kinda thought he was trying to prank me, but I figured I'd give him the benefit of the doubt and play along for at least a few minutes, just in case it was real. I couldn't resist. "You asshole," I said. "Nolan was terrified and you thought he was pranking you?" His eyes cleared, and he looked at me with a kind of venom generally reserved for looking at serial killers or people who kick puppies. "It wouldn't be the first time," he defended himself. "When you two were together, you used to—" "I wasn't even there!" I exploded. "And we would never do anything like that. Our pranks were like sending you texts from fake subscription services. Nothing that would ever mess with emotions or drag your parents in." Zoe put a hand on my shoulder. "Calm down," she said quietly. "It's not worth it. Don't you want to hear what he knows?" To Tristan she raised her voice and said, "He didn't mean it. About your parents and Nolan. You were saying?" Tristan gave me one final death glare, TM, but at Zoe's words he seemed to remember that he did actually want to talk about his trauma. Maybe it was therapeutic for him. Probably he was imagining that he was just talking to Zoe and that I wasn't here at all. Anyway, if you'll let me talk now, I was saying that Nolan and I hurried into my closet. We crawled back behind my shoes, closed the door, and crouched there together in the dark corner. We didn't really fit. I told him to scoot over and he whispered that he couldn't. His voice was shaking. That's when I began to believe him, because once we were quiet, I could hear what was happening downstairs better. There was some weird howl screech sound that sent shivers down my spine, more crashes, my parents yelling. I swear I even heard some distant singing. It all made my head hurt. At first it sounded like my parents were fighting, but then the screams were full of pain. Nolan looked at me in the dark, and he whispered, "We have to go help them. Is it a break-in? We can get Dad's gun from the office. We have to help them." And I said, "No, we can't." I held him back. He struggled at first, but after a minute or two he quieted down. He was crying quietly into my shirt. As we sat there and he cried, the sounds faded. The screams cut off in a horrible way that definitely meant bad news, and the crashes ceased. I heard heavy footsteps, and then it was quiet. He paused again, and I could have sworn his eyes were wet, though no tears fell. Even Tristan couldn't be a dick when he was remembering his parents' death. Say what you will about his relationship to me, but he did care about his family, especially his parents. This time I said nothing, because a sense of dread had settled over me. Hearing about Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds' death was stirring up all the awful memories of my own family's deaths. And in my case, I hadn't just listened to it. I'd watched them happen. Honestly, though, I wasn't feeling as unstable as usual thinking about that horrible day, so maybe my mental health really is improving. If that's true, I guess I have Zoe to thank for that. Tristan took a deep breath and continued. I pushed Nolan away and said, "Stay here. I'm going down to look." And he grabbed my arm and told me he was coming too. So I went and grabbed my dad's gun, and then we started slowly down the stairs. It was eerily quiet. We'd only made it down the first few steps before we saw the blood spatters on the walls. There were literally sprays of blood across our family photos hanging by the stairs. The smell was terrible. We stepped down into the living room, and there were blood and body parts and glass pieces everywhere. Nolan started crying again when he saw it. There were no bodies, though. "The kitchen," I said. Nolan shook his head but followed me. I wasn't wearing any shoes, and in just a few steps my feet were slick with blood and cut up with glass shards. It was worse than stepping on Legos. Apparently this was a joke, because he looked up at us expectantly. Zoe caught on quicker than I did and gave a little laugh. I just stared at him. He rolled his eyes at me. It was specifically at me, I could tell, and looked back at Zoe before continuing. The kitchen was awful. My dad's body was there. Well, whatever wasn't on the walls and spread across the living room anyway. The back door was open, with a trail of blood leading out there. I followed it, and from the doorway I could see my mom's body on the patio. It was less torn apart than my dad's, but there was still a lot of blood. And her head was gone. I think it exploded because I'm pretty sure I saw bits of brain matter on the bushes. Suddenly from behind me, Nolan yelled, "Tristan!" And I spun around to see some tall, skinless thing climbing through the shattered front window. I raised the gun and started firing, but I only hit its torso, and that didn't slow it down much. "The eyes! Its eyes look weird! Try those!" Nolan shouted, scrambling halfway up the stairs. The thing kept coming, and it let out that screech at her earlier. I don't know if it had just left our house but saw us moving around in there, or if it was still there the whole time. But now it started charging towards me. I aimed more carefully and shot for its eyes. I was just hoping Nolan's hunch was right. "It was," I said quietly. Nolan always was great at noticing details. He was going to study microbiology or genetics or something super sciencey like that. He would have been a kick-ass scientist. Zoe reached out and squeezed my hand. Tristan gave me the signature death glare, TM. "I know," he said. He was always the smarter kid of the two of us. "Doesn't take much," I muttered under my breath. Zoe dug her nails into my hand and raised her eyebrows at me. She was clearly telling me to shut up and stop provoking him. I rolled my eyes but stayed silent, because to be honest, I did want to hear where this is going and how it circled back to him supposedly knowing about the elevator. Anyway, I aimed and shot for its eyes, or the hole where its eye should have been, and that worked. The thing screeched and fell to its side. Some kind of thick purple liquid oozed down its face. I shot again, aiming for its other eye and then for its neck, and after both those shots, it finally stopped moving and laid there on the kitchen floor next to my dad. Nolan and I just kind of stared at each other in shock. "What the hell are they?" he asked. "I have no idea," I said. Out the window, we heard more screams and roars and howls. I saw glimpses of people running by, of creatures I'd never seen before in the street. I was afraid one of them might see us through the window, so I grabbed Nolan's arm and pulled him upstairs. We went into my parents' bedroom, pulled down all the blinds and curtains, and turned on the TV. The local news was showing footage of monsters and bodies in a giant dome, which they said had cut off the city. Lines of cars stretched down the highway trying to get out. It was literally broadcast live as monsters mowed them down like they were blades of grass. Then the news helicopter was hit by something, I guess, because there were screams, and then the screen went to static. I turned it off and we sat there in silence. "What the fuck is happening?" "Why here?" Nolan asked. "I don't know," I told him, "but we can't get out of the city, so we'll have to manage here." "It's like the apocalypse," he said. I didn't have a response to that. We just packed up our bags and prepared to leave. We spent the night there, but we didn't feel safe with the destroyed downstairs, and we didn't want to stay there with our parents' bodies. It made Nolan start to cry again every time we had to cross the kitchen to get food. So we left the next morning. "I just missed you then," I said. "I tried to come find Nolan, you know. I went to your house on the second day, and several times after that. I saw your parents, but I never saw any signs of you." He didn't miss a beat, the asshole. "In that case, thank God we left," he said. "Nolan was better off with me than he would have been with you." "I don't know," I retorted. "I'm not the one who got eaten by a mic. I've been surviving the whole time." "That's enough, boys," interjected Zoe. Tristan shot me yet another death glare, TM, and said, "Well, after that we spent the next few months moving around, killing monsters, staying alive. It won't surprise you to know that Nolan, despite everything, thought the monsters were fascinating. He always said that if the situation were different, if he could have looked at them in a lab, he would have loved to study their biology. But I wasn't about to let him drag in a monster body off the street to look at." "I could have helped you fight them if you knew more about them," offered Zoe gently. Tristan frowned at her. "Yeah, but I wasn't about to bring one of them home with us. What if any of them reanimated and killed us in our sleep? Not to mention the fact that Nolan noticed a camera on one of their bodies pretty early on. Once we knew about the cameras, even Nolan agreed we shouldn't be messing with the monsters more than we had to." He was still good at finding their weaknesses, though. "We were a great team," he said thoughtfully. "He studied them when he could and figured out how to kill them, and I handled the actual killing. You know, I think those couple of months were the best we'd gotten along since we were kids. Just us against the world. No one else." He shot me an accusatory look. Seems like Zoe may have been onto something with the jealousy thing. Tristan also still hadn't mentioned anything about the elevator, and I was getting antsy. Was it a lie so that it had an excuse to keep our attention while talking through his traumas? Did he just want to get our hopes up and then crush them? I wouldn't put it past him. "What about the elevator?" I prompted. Tristan sighed. "I think I saw it the day before we ran across the bear. We were out on a supply run, and I insisted on going a different way than we planned. It made Nolan nervous, and he said we should stick to the plan, but there were a lot of monsters along that route. I told him we were switching paths, and he could either come with me or I'd leave him behind. After a while, he followed me. But then I heard a lot of growling, and kind of a mechanical squealing from this building, and I peeked inside to investigate, and I saw a room open up, with a big sliding door like an elevator. I mean, I didn't think of it as an elevator at the time, but that is what it looked like. And monsters poured out of it. The elevator must have been wall-to-wall packed. Once the room was empty, the doors closed, and I heard the whirring as the elevator went back down. I wanted to go look closer right then, but Nolan was freaking out. He kept saying that he told me we shouldn't have come this way, look what we'd stumbled into. I said, it might be a way out. And he said, we can't know that without studying it more, we can't just run into it. We have to watch first and only go when we know it's safe. That's what you made me do when Mom and Dad died, remember? You were right then and I'm right now. Of course I listened. He's the smart one. But when we tried to go back the next day, well, that's when the bear got me. Tristan shook his head. It was the first time Nolan got a guess wrong. We'd never met one of those fuckers before. As soon as we met it, Nolan froze and whispered, it must hunt by sight, look at its giant eyes. I was nodding as he said this, because if I had managed to put that together during my first encounter with the mic, there's no way Nolan hadn't. Then he said, it must have blind spots. I bet it's like a horse. You can't see a short distance directly in front of it or directly behind it. We just have to get close enough to get in his blind spots, and the rest is easy. That sounded legitimate to me, he'd never been wrong before, but I still wanted to protect him best I could. He is my little brother. So I volunteered for the front blind spot, since that seemed riskier, and I told him to take the back. It was waiting. It had seen us move right before we froze. We both took off sprinting at the same time, in opposite directions. As soon as it pursued me, I turned around to run right back towards it, hoping that I could get into the blind spot between its eyes and kill it. Nolan immediately turned around too, and started coming up behind it. I couldn't see him, but I heard him. The bear's breath was hot and heavy. I raised the gun and aimed for its eyes, but the eyes never left me. There wasn't a blind spot. I tried to fire, but it swatted the gun right out of my hand like it was light as a feather. I didn't have time to do anything else before it lunged forward and pinned me to the ground. Then the mouth opened wider and wider, and the black hole started to drag me in. He trailed off, shivering. I'd never seen Tristan look so vulnerable, not even when he was covered in blood back at the scene of the massacre. I kept hoping Nolan would be able to kill it as I was sucked into the darkness. I heard him trying. There were gunshots, and he was calling, I'll save you, Tristan, sounding more and more desperate. But then the noises were gone, and there was nothing but empty blackness. I thought it got him too, but he must have escaped somehow. I don't think he killed it, since I had to wait for you to free me, he said with disdain, looking at me. But maybe he at least had the common sense to freeze and wait it out when he realized he couldn't kill it. Maybe it got away and he's been looking for it since. He finally went silent, and it seemed he was done for good this time. I was silent for a minute too, thinking. I'd worried the same thing when I was facing the mic to save Zoe. It chilled my blood to think that the exact fear I'd had about never being able to find the same mic again may have been a reality for my best friend. But then there was still the fucking elevator. Tristan had been intentionally vague when describing that part. No mention of a specific location. If he thought I'd missed that, he was insane. I may not be as good as details as Nolan, but a blind man could have noticed the gaping holes in that story. What about the elevator? I asked again. Don't you think that's our best bet at getting out of here? Tristan gave me, you guessed it, the certified death glare, TM, and said, maybe, but I don't care. I don't want to help you. I just want to find Nolan. I threw my hands up in frustration. Yeah, but so do I. You may not like it, but I'm at least as close to him as you ever were. We'll help search for him if you tell us where the goddamn elevator is. Don't you want to get out of this hellscape too? The asshole had the audacity to smirk at me. That's when I realized. He was enjoying this. He was taking pleasure in the fact that he had leverage over me. You know how I said I don't hate him? Yeah, I might be taking that back. Fine, I'll tell you, he said, still smirking. His eyes never left mine. On one condition. I want to talk to you, Eli. Alone.